Still there are some naive homeopaths who believe that researchers of IIT Mumbai have proved how homeopathy works, and declare that homeopathy is nanomedicine, without even knowing what really these nanoparticles are. I would request all homeopaths to read that research report carefully, and try to filter out the exact factual findings of the team and separate them from their hypothesis and media hype. According to reports, IITB students of Chemical Engineering Department bought commonly available homeopathic pills from neighborhood shops, prepared highly diluted solutions and checked under powerful electron microscopes to find nanoparticles of the original metal. Paper claims that they showed that certain highly diluted homeopathic remedies made from metals still contain measurable amounts of the starting material, even at extreme dilutions of 1 part in 10 raised to 400-200 C, according to Dr. Jayesh Belair, head of the IITB team. Dr. Belair further said that the hypothesis is that nanobubbles form on the surface of the highly diluted mixtures and float to the surface, retaining the original drug particles, and that they believe they have cracked the homeopathy conundrum. The hypothesis is that a nanoparticle nanobubble rises to the surface of the diluted solution. It is this one of the top layer that is collected and further diluted. So, the concentration remains. This is the real story of the research. Everything else is mere hypothesis and media hype. By detecting the presence of nanoparticles in the samples of homeopathic drugs, what did the IITB team actually prove? They only proved that the market samples of 6C, 30C and 200C are not much different from each other, and the manufacturers are fooling the profession by selling very low potencies below Avogadro limit containing original drug particles labeled as ultra-high dilutions. The research team themselves also got fooled by conducting this research using these fake ultra-high potencies. This kind of research study should have been done only using samples prepared by researchers themselves, to be reliable, not with market samples of homeopathic dilutions. Researchers are also bound to explain why they used homeopathic dilutions of metal-derived medicines only for the study. 2,000 ml of dilutions of each drug was taken separately, and subjected for evaporation until 4 ml remained. This concentrated, 4 ml which remained was used for study. Using transmission electron microscopy TEM, electron diffraction and chemical analysis by inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectroscopy ICP-AES, they detected the presence of physical entities in these extreme dilutions, in the form of nanoparticles of the starting metals and their aggregates. They also found that the concentrations reach a plateau at the 6C potency and beyond. They also have shown that despite large differences in the degree of dilution from 6C to 200C 1012 to 10400, there were no major differences in the nature of the particle shape and size of the starting material and their absolute concentrations in pgml. They also found that these nanoparticles of starting materials were present only in the one top layer. The remaining part contained no nanoparticles. According to them, during potentization, this nanoparticle nanobubble complex rises to the surface and can be within a monolayer once the total metal concentrations are well below 1 ppm. It is this one of the top layer of the solution which is collected and added to the next vessel, into 99 parts of fresh solvent, and the succession process is repeated. This transfer of the top one layer in each step will ensure that once we reach below a certain concentration, i.e. well within a monolayer, the entire starting material continues to go from one dilution to the next, resulting in an asymptote beyond 6C. What fundamental truth regarding homeopathy do you think has been proved and accepted by the world, by this finding, of IITB scientists? Did they in any way prove that these nanoparticles floating on top layers of dilutions are the real active principles of potentized homeopathic drugs? Did they explain our theory of similia similibus curantur, on the basis of presence of these nanoparticles? Could they detect any nanoparticles of parent drugs in any complex drugs of vegetable or animal origin, other than potencies of elemental metals such as gold, copper and iron? Can you imagine why the IIT team conducted their experiments using only potencies of elemental metals? Doctors, we have to apply a lot of logical thinking before declaring that the universal truth has to be accepted by the world some day or the other. IITB showed the way. Remember, metallic elements are triturated before subjecting to the subsequent process of serial dilutions and succussions. During this violent rubbing, of triturating, some metal ions may be converted into nanoparticles. If the higher potencies were not prepared exactly as prescribed, some of these nanoparticles may naturally remain in traces in higher potencies also. The IIT team actually may have detected these remnants of nanoparticles floating in upper layers of solutions. This finding by no way proves that these nanoparticles are the real active principles of homeopathic high-potency drugs. The presence of traces of nanoparticles in high-potency solutions only shows that the samples they bought from neighboring shops were not perfectly potentized. Only elemental, drugs and simple minerals can be converted into nanoparticles by process of trituration. Hence, nanoparticles of complex molecules of complex drugs can never be detected. Nobody can prepare nanoparticles of complex molecules such as atropine or strychnine by homeopathic trituration process. I think the IIT team had this mind when they decided to conduct their experiments with metallic elements. Only do you subscribe to their reported observation that only top layer is therapeutically effective, since it is only there the nanoparticles are floating. What will happen if we remove not only top layers, but whole upper half from a bottle of potentized medicines? Do you think the remaining part will not be effective therapeutically? If the nanoparticles are only in traces, and they float on top layers of liquid, it is obvious that these nanoparticles are not the real active principles of potentized drugs. In order to explain our everyday experience that every single drop of drug is powerful, the whole drug should be uniformly saturated with this nanoparticles, and if that were the case, we cannot say it is in trace amounts. Kindly think over. It is said in the study the report that they have shown that despite large differences in the degree of dilution from 6C to 200C, there were no major differences in the shape and size of the starting material and their absolute concentrations. What does this observation show? If there were no major differences in the shape and size of the starting material and their absolute concentrations, from 6C to 200C, it leads us to some serious doubts whether the samples used were really genuine. If dilutions were really prepared in prescribed manner, 6C and 200C will never contain same quantity and concentrations of starting material. This observation of researchers lacks logic. Overall, there are many gray areas in this study, which should be seriously considered by homeopaths. Doctors, do you think this detection of some traces of nanoparticles of metal elements floating on top layers of the dilution in any way help homeopathy in providing a scientific explanation for similar similibus curantur, or mechanism of homeopathic therapeutics? The hype over this study has grown to such a stage that some homeopaths even declare that the IIT study has proved that homeopathy is nanotechnology. IIT team only said that they could detect traces of nanoparticles of naturally occurring metal minerals in the samples they tested. Nanoparticles and nanotechnology is not the same. Nano only refers to a range of measurement in the study of ultra-minute scales of matter. Nanotechnology is a modern technology dealing with matter at nano range of measurement, and manipulating them to prepare various nano devices. No IIT scientist said nothing about nanotechnology in homeopathy. They only said that they could detect traces of nanoparticles of elements in homeopathic drugs. Why we utterly fail to note the difference and apply some logical thinking before being part of this hype. Traces of elements cannot mimic the medicinal properties of complex molecules. Did this study provide any clue regarding how homeopathy works? I consider this as mere hype intended to defame and injure homeopathy. If we accept that homeopathy potencies act by traces of nanoparticles remaining in them even after dilution, the whole laborious process of homeopathic potentization become a meaningless waste. Can homeopaths subscribe to this injurious interpretation? Why should we have to first prove there are some drug particles present in our medicines to claim our rights to exist? So far we were saying that potentized homeopathic medicines do not contain any original drug molecules. Why should we change our stand now? How can we say that the traces of nanoparticles detected to be floating on the top layer is the real medicinal substance in our potentized drugs? If that inference were correct, we should know traces would not be present everywhere in our potentized drugs. But we are using not only top layers, but every drop of our drugs and getting expected therapeutic results. Obviously, our drugs contain not traces, but are saturated with some sorts of medicinal factors, whatever they may be. Something present everywhere cannot be in traces. Actually, enemies of homeopathy can utilize this nanoparticle theory to prove that whatever homeopaths were saying about homeopathic potentization was ultimately wrong. If the active principles of homeopathic drugs are remnants of basic drugs existing in traces, the whole process of potentization would naturally become meaningless. Does anybody think that such an interpretation would help homeopathy? But our homeopaths succumb to the media hype even without fully reading the lines of the available reports carefully, applying a pinch of logical reasoning. It shows the scientific starvation homeopaths are long subjected to. If they had read the report carefully, they would have realized that the IITB study only proves that the researchers could detect some traces of nanoparticles of metal elements floating on the one top layer of the solution of homeopathic sugar pills they bought from neighboring shops. Nothing more, nothing less. Really, this nanoparticle theory is going to be used as the greatest evidence against homeopathy by the skeptics in future. Once this nanoparticles theory is accepted by the profession, we will also have to accept the argument that any samples that is proved negative for the presence of nanoparticles is ineffective. Obviously, we will have to yield to the argument that any cures we obtain from such homeopathic drugs that do not contain nanoparticles are mere placebo effect. What will we say when finally the government makes a legislation banning all homeopathic potencies that do not contain nanoparticles of parent drugs? Once the presence of nanoparticles is accepted as the criteria for effectiveness of homeopathic potencies, the same IIT scientists or somebody else can develop a sophisticated device to test the presence of nanoparticles in any given sample of homeopathic drug. Government can easily make some legislation making it mandatory to subject every homeopathic drugs to this test before getting certified. Hope the homeopaths would realize the gravity of the situation created by this nanoparticle research. Moreover, how would this nanoparticle theory explain the mechanism of therapeutic action of potentized homeopathic drugs? All homeopathic medicines are not prepared from simple, metallic elements, but complex drugs of vegetable, mineral and animal origin containing highly complex molecules. Can presence of nanoparticles, of metal elements contained in these complex drug molecules mimic the highly complex molecular level properties of those very large molecules? I would also like to invite your attention to another aspect of nanoparticle theory. There exist a lot of apprehensions over the topic of nanotoxicity. If we accept nanoparticles as the active principles of potentized homeopathic medicines, ongoing nanotoxicology studies can be made applicable to homeopathic medicines also. If the present apprehensions in the scientific world regarding nanotoxicity finally turns out into a strict legislational processes globally, and homeopathic medicines are included in the group of nanoparticle materials, homeopathy will have a very tough time to come. I warn homeopaths against falling prey to the hype over the reported IIT findings. It proves nothing positive for homeopathy. Ultimately, it only provides some new weapons to those who want to disprove the whole theory of homeopathic potentization and ban homeopathy medicines by raising nanotoxicity concerns.